4 minutes and 20 seconds. That was how long I stood 200 meters from the largest predator in the Veth wildlands with my barrier deactivated, watching ancient eyes decide whether I would live or die. The elder Veth Marath was closer to geology than biology. 7 limbs moved with the patience of tectonic plates. Layered plating caught the dawn light in ways that suggested this creature had been alive longer than my entire bloodline. Its breath came in low pulses that I felt in my chest before I heard them with my ears. Specialist Davin Korath stood beside me. No weapon drawn, no barrier active. His breathing had dropped below what my atmospheric sensors could register, and I had spent 8 days trying to understand how that was possible. The creature's head turned, massive, deliberate. Those eyes found mine and held them with the weight of a question I did not yet know how to answer. I thought I am 300 cycles old. I am a crown princess of the Serenthi Dominion. I have stood before councils and courts and rooms full of people who wanted me to fail. I have stood in worse rooms than this one. The Veth Marath took one step forward. My suit sensors screamed. My heart rate spiked. Every instinct I had been trained to trust told me to run to activate the barrier, to do anything except stand here and let this thing close the distance. I did not move. Davin's voice came quiet beside me. Not reassuring, just present. Hold. I held. The creature stopped. It made a sound I had no translation file for. Something between a warning and something older. Something that was not quite aggression. Something that was asking a question I was only beginning to understand. Then it turned, not retreating, not fleeing. It turned with the certainty of a thing that had reached its conclusion and no longer needed the subject of its analysis. It walked back into the deep forest. Each step unhurried. Each step the step of something that had decided. I stood in the clearing and felt the morning sun on my face and realized I was shaking. Davin looked at me. His expression was the same expression he had worn for 8 days. Calm, present, carrying something I still did not have a name for. You did good, princess. I wanted to ask him how. I wanted to ask him why. I wanted to ask him what just happened and what it meant, and whether I had actually understood anything at all. Instead, I said, "How did you know?" He looked back at the tree line where the creature had disappeared. I didn't. 8 days earlier. The briefing room smelled like recycled air and Commander Thrace's disappointment. I had been standing at attention for 6 minutes. That was intentional on his part. He wanted me to feel the weight of what was about to happen before he said it. I gave him nothing in return. A crowned princess of the Serenthi Dominion does not shift her weight. She does not look at the walls. She stands, and she waits, and she lets the room know she has stood in worse rooms than this one. Your assignment, Thrace said finally, is the Veth Wildlands Survey. 8 rotations, fauna documentation, boundary markers for the Accord Expansion Zone. Frontier work, beneath my rank by any reasonable measure. But the key thing about punishments dressed as honor was that they had to be acceptable publicly. My father's council had decided that sending me to the furthest edge of Accord territory was acceptable publicly. A standard survey mission, nothing remarkable. Not a demotion, not a consequence. I had disagreed with 3 senior council members in front of 12 foreign dignitaries. I had been right. That had made it worse. Your security detail has already been briefed, Thrace said and gestured toward the door behind me. I turned. 1 human walked in. Not a unit, not a squad, not even 2. 1 man, medium height, dark close-cut hair, field gear that had seen considerably more use than regulations technically permitted. He had 1 standard-issue sidearm on his right hip. His rank insignia said Specialist, which in the human ranking system translated roughly to the Serenthi phrase for someone whose specific function had outgrown its available category labels. He did not bow when he saw me. He did not salute. He nodded once. The way you nod at a transit gate you have walked through enough times to have stopped thinking about it. Specialist Davin Korath, Thrace said. He will be accompanying you. I kept my voice level with no effort at all. 1 individual constitutes my security detail for an 8-rotation wildlands transit. The Human Accord has provided their highest qualified specialists for frontier fauna environments, Thrace said in the tone of a man who had already filed this entire interaction underdone. You depart at dawn cycle. I looked at Korath. He was studying the wildlands terrain map on the wall behind my head. Not performing attention. Actually looking at it, his eyes moved across the elevation grid the way a hand moves across a surface it is trying to understand. I filed him under ceremonial, a symbol present for the optics of human Serenthi cooperation. A polite gesture from the Accord, dressed up as security. His boots were worn down at the outer heel, the left more than the right. I did not know what that indicated about his gait or his history, and I did not have time to work it out, and I told myself it was irrelevant. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a great many things. The survey team assembled at the departure bay at first light. Dr. Kyle arrived early and checked every piece of equipment 3 times. Thorough and meticulous and visibly unhappy about the wildlands posting in the way thorough people are unhappy about situations that refuse to reward thoroughness. He was senior fauna analyst, excellent credentials, terrible survival instincts. Dr. Sarah was younger and treated new information as interesting rather than threatening, which I appreciated. She had lost a mentor in a previous survey. I had read that in her file. She documented everything with the focus of someone who understood that data might outlive the people who collected it. Tech Joran occupied the practical middle ground between the other two. Quiet, competent. He ran the portable relay and mapping grid with the efficiency of someone who had learned that talking less and working more kept you alive longer. They were adequate. I had worked with worse. Davencorth introduced himself to all 3 in 2 sentences and then walked to the equipment bay to run checks. He checked things I had not listed on the standard checklist. He ran the barrier generators through a secondary calibration sequence I had never seen documented. He cross-referenced the atmospheric sensor readings with manual measurements twice without being asked. I watched him for 3 minutes before I made myself stop. That evening, I pulled his personnel file. Most of it was classified, not pending clearance, not above my access tier, classified, flat, black pages where his training history should have been, black pages where his field deployment record should have been. The visible portions showed 12 years of service, no disciplinary notes, and a list of commendations with no descriptions attached. Just dates and a commendation code. No detail. His last posting commander had left a single note at the end of the file. Somehow it had survived the classification review. It said, "Trust his instincts in the field. Do not ask him to explain them. He will not be able to, and you will waste time. Neither of you have." I read it 3 times. Then I went to run my pre-departure perimeter check and found him already there, standing at the barrier edge, facing the tree line. No equipment in hand, no scanner running, just standing in the dark, looking at the forest. I watched him for 11 minutes. Nothing came to the tree line. The Veth wildlands were documented as active at night. 23 species confirmed nocturnal in this region, several of them large, several of them territorial. The forest edge should have been loud. Instead, it was quiet in a way that felt less like absence and more like attention. I went back to my tent. In the morning before the others were awake, I walked the perimeter and found his boot prints going past the barrier edge, 140 meters into the tree line. Then back. Clean trail. No sign of anything following. He had gone into the forest in the dark, and he had come back, and there was nothing to show for it except the prints. I stood there for a long moment. Then I opened a new log entry. I wrote, "I have made a cataloging error somewhere. I have not yet determined where." The Veth wildlands opened up like a wound on the first morning. The terrain cracked and shifted at the edge of the survey zone where old geological pressure had split the ground along fault lines wide enough to swallow a transport vehicle. The trees grew out of those cracks at angles that made no biological sense, angled toward each other like fingers closing. Everything here had adapted to a world that was trying to close around it. We moved in standard Serenthi survey formation. Dr. Kale and Dr. Sarah handled the documentation arrays. Tech Joran managed the portable relay and the mapping grid. I ran point assessment. Davencorth walked at the rear. He moved differently from any of us. I noticed it in the first hour and spent the second hour telling myself I had not noticed it. We moved with the focused, efficient motion of trained people doing a trained task. Korth moved like he was trying not to be a sound. His footfalls barely registered on my suit sensors. Every step placed exactly. No weight wasted, no dry ground cracked when it could be avoided. The Serenthi word for this kind of movement is stalking, but that was not quite right. Stalking implied predation, implied purpose directed outward. This was something else. This was movement with the volume turned all the way down, as if he were trying to pass through the forest as a concept rather than a physical presence. By midday, we had covered 9 kilometers and documented 42 separate fauna species, none of them above mid-class threat ratings. Dr. Carroll was pleased. Dr. Sarah was methodical. Tech Joran was keeping pace. Davencorth had not spoken since morning. At one point, I turned to check formation and found him crouched 20 meters off the path, examining the ground beside a dense root cluster. He was not scanning, he was looking. his head angled slightly, his eyes moving in a slow, deliberate pattern across the soil. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Reading." "Reading what?" He pointed at a section of disturbed earth I had not flagged. "Something large moved through here about 6 hours ago. Came from the east. Changed direction here." He pointed to a spot 2 meters further. Then went north. I checked my sensor array. It had logged nothing at this site. Either the sensors had a gap in coverage, or whatever had moved through here had not moved in a way the sensors were calibrated to detect. I did not say either of those things out loud. "Noted," I said. "Continue formation." He stood up and fell back into position. The second day brought the first wrong thing. A pack of Veth stalkers appeared on the eastern ridge around mid-morning. Mid-class predators, pack hunters, documented as highly aggressive to survey teams in 3 separate recorded incidents. They were the reason Accord protocol required barrier activation the moment they appeared within 300 meters. I activated the barrier. Dr. KL was already backing towards center formation. Dr. Sarah was documenting with admirable composure. The Veth stalkers tracked us along the ridge for 2 full hours. Then they turned off. Not chased away, not distracted, not lured by a competing food source I could identify on any sensor. They simply assessed the situation and decided the situation was not worth their time. I logged this as unusual fauna behavior, likely driven by competing territorial pressure in the northern sector. Cause unclear. Davin Korath had watched the ridge the entire 2 hours. When the pack turned off, he looked back at the trail ahead and kept walking. He said nothing. That evening, Dr. KL came to stand beside me while I worked. 2 unusual fauna encounters, he said, keeping his voice low. No contact, no aggression. Something is keeping them off. Terrain variables, I said. Pheromone interference. We are carrying multiple unfamiliar chemical signatures. Dr. KL looked at me. He had the expression of a thorough person who respected a bad explanation more than no explanation. "The barrier was down for most of the second day," he said, "after the stalkers turned off." "I know. So if it was the barrier, I know KO." He went back to his station. On the third day, something large paralleled us through the western vegetation corridor for an entire afternoon rotation. I could not get a clean identification from the sensors because it never broke cover, but the displacement of the canopy and the thermal trace put it well above mid-class. It kept a consistent distance. It matched our pace changes. It was not investigating. It was making a decision. It turned off at dusk. I spent that evening running diagnostics on every sensor unit we carried. They were all functioning within normal parameters. That night, I went looking for Davin Korath. I found him at the barrier edge, again, standing in the dark, facing the forest. I walked to him without planning what to say. That was unusual for me. I plan what I say. I have a verbal structure prepared before most conversations. But I walked to him without anything prepared and stood beside him and said, "You went into the forest last night, 140 meters past the barrier." Why, he did not look surprised. He had known I would find the tracks, needed to let them know we're here. That is the opposite of standard survival protocol. Standard protocol assumes you're trying to avoid notice. He looked at me for the first time in this conversation. "I'm not. You are trying to be noticed by apex predators. I'm trying to be read." I did not have an immediate response to that. The concept was backwards. Everything about his approach was backwards. "Read as what?" I asked finally. "As something that doesn't fit the categories they're expecting." I looked at the tree line. Something was out there. My sensors told me so. It was large and it was staying back. "The forest was silent when you walked out last night," I said. "My atmospheric readings showed no fauna activity within detection range while you were beyond the barrier." "Yeah, that should not be possible. This region is documented as highly active at night." "It is active," he said. "It was just being quiet." "Why?" He was silent for a moment, not evasive silence, thinking silence. "Because when something that should scare you doesn't act scared," he said slowly, "you pay attention. You try to figure out what category it belongs in. And while you're figuring that out, you're not attacking." I thought about that, about the Veth stalkers that had tracked us for 2 hours and then simply left, about the creature in the western quarter that had matched our pace all afternoon and then turned away at dusk. "You are saying the fauna here is categorizing us." "Everything categorizes. It's base level pattern recognition. Safe to approach, not safe to approach, predator, prey, threat, food." He looked back at the dark. "We're confusing the system." We, humans. I had read his species file. I knew the basics. High-gravity homeworld, competitive biosphere, recent addition to the Accord. I had not looked deeper than that because I had not thought it was relevant. I was beginning to think I had been wrong about that too. Your physical capability is insufficient to threaten apex-class wildlands predators, I said. It was not an insult, it was an observation. Yeah, he agreed easily. He was not offended. Then what are they reading? He turned to look at me directly. Full attention. I had learned by now that this was not his default expression. He gave most things a portion of his attention efficient and sufficient. Full attention from him was a specific thing, and it had weight. What are you, he said, when you're not afraid of something that should scare you, when you've been scared by it long enough that the fear just became part of how you move? I did not have an answer for that. He turned back to the tree line. Whatever that is, he said, that's what they read. I stood there for a while, long enough to be certain that the thing in the forest had not moved closer. Long enough for the night to get its second kind of dark, the kind that comes after the first darkness settles and stops being a shock. Then I went back to my tent. I wrote in my log. I asked him about the silence. He confirmed fauna are categorizing us based on parameters I do not yet understand. He is not aware of how the process works in technical terms. He is simply the product of it. I paused. Then I wrote, this is more concerning than if he had a technique. A technique can be cataloged. A technique can be understood and reproduced and prepared for. This is not a technique. I stopped writing. I stared at the entry for a long time. Then I added, I have been wrong about him since the first moment. I have been wrong about him in a specific and measurable way. I would like to note for the record that I do not often make this kind of error. I am noting it now because I think the scale of the error is going to get larger before this survey is finished. I was right about that. The fourth day began with death. We found the kill site 3 kilometers into the morning's transit. The canopy overhead was torn. Not broken by wind, torn. By something that had moved through the upper vegetation with enough force to shred branches as thick as my arm. The ground told the rest of the story. Blood, not much. Whatever had done this had been efficient. The prey animal was gone. Dragged or carried, only the kill site remained. And the tracks. 7 toes, each one ending in a point that had sunk deep enough into the soil to suggest weight I did not want to calculate. The spacing between the tracks was wider than I was tall. Dr. Kale stopped at the perimeter of the site. His face had gone the particular shade of pale that comes from reading data you wish you had not found. That's a Vethkai track, he said quietly. Confirmed, Dr. Sarah said. She was already scanning. Her voice was steady, but I heard the edge underneath. Size estimate puts it at the upper range of documented specimens, possibly larger. How long ago, I asked. Tech Joran checked his atmospheric readings. Thermal decay suggests 6 to 8 hours. Early morning, just after dawn. I pulled up the territorial map on my heads-up display. We were on the eastern edge of documented Vethkai range. The database listed 2 confirmed individuals in this sector. Both were classified as extreme threat. The Accord had lost 3 survey teams to Vethkai encounters in the last 5 cycles. The protocol for Vethkai contact was clear. Activate barrier at first detection, attempt no engagement, await extraction. We were 42 kilometers from the nearest extraction point with 4 days of water remaining. I looked at Davin Korath. He was crouched beside the largest track, not scanning it, not taking samples. He had taken off his right glove and placed his bare hand flat against the impression in the soil. His palm fit inside the track with room to spare. He held it there for a long moment. Then he stood up and pulled his glove back on. What was that? I asked, getting familiar. With what? With what's here? I had a follow-up question. Something in his tone told me the follow-up question would produce an answer I was not yet ready to categorize. I did not ask it. We moved on. The Vethkai came in the afternoon. It came out of the eastern ravine at 200 meters and closed to 70 in 12 seconds. I had read the database entry. I had seen the footage from previous encounters. I thought I understood what a Vethkai was. I was wrong. The database does not prepare you for the sound. A Vethkai in motion is not something you hear. It is something you feel. The ground transmitted the impacts of its footfalls through my boots into my bones. 4 limbs for locomotion. 2 ended in impact structures that could punch through standard Serenthi field armor. Layered natural plating that made it effectively resistant to standard issue sidearms. It had ended 3 Serenthi survey personnel in the last recorded encounter, and that team had been better equipped than we were. Dr. Kael hit his emergency signal. Dr. Sarah hit hers. Tech Joran was already retreating to center formation. I activated the barrier and stepped into position. Standard protocol. Correct procedure. Davenkorth did not activate his barrier. He turned to face it. Not with aggression, not posturing. He simply turned to face it the way you turn to face a sound you were expecting to hear eventually. The Vethkai stopped. 65 meters. It could have closed the remaining distance in 3 seconds. I know because I was calculating it. I was calculating extraction vectors and barrier sustainability ratings and sidearm effectiveness against Vethkai plating, and I was reaching the end of every one of those calculations at the same time, and none of them had good answers. The Vethkai made a sound. I did not have a translation file for it. It was somewhere between a warning call and something lower, something slower, something that was not quite aggression, something that was asking a question I did not have the vocabulary to identify. Davenkorth stood at the barrier edge. His arms were at his sides. Not relaxed, not tense. Something that was neither of those things and had no name in either of our languages that I could find quickly enough. 47 seconds. I counted them. Dr. Sarah was documenting because she was the kind of scientist who documented even the things that were likely to end her. I found myself grateful for that in a way I did not have time to examine. The Vethkai turned, not with urgency. It shifted 40 degrees west into the dense vegetation. It pushed through brush that would have taken my team's significant effort to cross, and it did not look back. The emergency signals were still active. The barrier was still running. Dr. Kael's breathing was audible from 4 meters away. Davenkorth watched the spot where the Vethkai had been for a moment. Then he turned back to the trail. "We can move," he said. That night, I wrote 437 words in my private log explaining why the Vethkai had turned off. Territorial boundary proximity, competing scent markers, possible injury making it reluctant to pursue, environmental conditions suppressing its aggression response. I read all 437 words back to myself. I deleted 420 of them. I wrote, "I have made a cataloging error somewhere. I am not yet certain where. I am becoming certain it is larger than I first believed." Then I went looking for answers. The Serenthi Xenobiology Archive had entries on every spacefaring species in the Accord. The human section was shorter than I would have expected for a species that had been known to us for nearly 2 of their centuries. Mostly external observation. Limited interview records. A note from the first formal contact team that I had skimmed before, but had not read with proper attention. I read it now. The contact team had documented a human facility where large fauna were kept. The animals were not restrained. They were provided with food and what the contact team described as enrichment activities. The contact team had identified 3 of the kept species as apex-class predators by the standards of the human homeworld, a high-gravity, high-competition planet with a dense and aggressive biosphere. The contact team's note read, "The humans interact with these predatory animals in ways that suggest either a significant suppression of natural fear response or an unusual degree of behavioral conditioning in the animals. We were unable to determine which. The animals did not display aggression toward the humans. The humans were unconcerned. We have flagged this for psychological review." The flag had been reviewed. The review conclusion filed 2 years after the initial observation said, "Response likely cultural rather than physiological. Familiarity-based confidence with local fauna, not transferable to other species. Classification interesting. No further action required." No further action required. Someone had looked at a species that kept apex predators as companions, called it a cultural quirk, and moved on. I pulled up the human homeworld biology database. The world was called Earth. I read the evolutionary section. I read it twice. Then I sat back and I did something I very rarely do. I closed all my open files and I sat in the dark with no data running, and I just thought. Humans had evolved in an open environment on a high-gravity world with a competitive biosphere. That part I had known in a general way. What I had not looked at directly before was the predation pressure they had evolved under. The database listed by era the apex fauna of the human homeworld across their evolutionary history. Large feline predators, massive canine packs, reptiles of significant size and speed, aquatic hunters, avian hunters, insects capable of ending a human life in minutes. For the majority of their evolutionary development as a species, something larger and faster and better armed had been hunting them. Not occasionally, not seasonally, constantly. They had not been the apex of their environment. They had been somewhere in the middle, with better cognitive function than most things around them, but worse physical capability than the things trying to end them. And then somewhere in the long record of their history, something had changed. Not their bodies. Their bodies had not changed significantly. They were still slow relative to most of their predators, still lacking natural armor, still lacking venom or significant natural weapons. What had changed was the way they moved through being hunted. The database called it persistence hunting, a technique where the hunter did not chase the prey to ground immediately the way every other predator I had ever studied did, but instead followed it, patiently, relentlessly, over distances and time frames that exhausted the prey's acute panic response and left it with nowhere to go and nothing left to run on. They had developed this because they had to. They had been hunted too long. They had become very good at being in the presence of things that wanted to end them. They had learned to carry that experience the way you carry a familiar weight, adjusting your stride instead of being thrown by it. The contact team had called it familiarity-based confidence. It was not familiarity. It was something that fear becomes when it has been carried long enough and heavy enough that the person carrying it has had to build an entirely new kind of internal structure to hold it. I closed the database. I opened my tent flap and looked out across the camp. Davenkorath was at the perimeter. He was always at the perimeter when I checked, standing at the tree line edge, facing the forest. I walked to him. I did not plan what to say. That was unusual for me. I plan what I say. I have a verbal structure prepared before most conversations. But I walked to him without anything prepared and stood beside him and said, "Your species was prey." He looked at me, not defensive, not proud, not even particularly interested in the fact that I was bringing this up at this hour. Just present. "Yeah," he said, "for a significant portion of your evolutionary history. Pretty much the whole thing depending on how you measure it." I looked at the tree line. Something was out there. My sensors told me so. It was large and it was staying back. "Does that affect how you function in environments like this?" I asked. I kept my voice clinical. An inquiry. He considered it with genuine seriousness, which I appreciated. "Probably," he said. "I don't think about it that way, though." "How do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive quiet, thinking quiet. It's like he started then stopped. Tried it again. "You know how a material gets stronger when you work it? You put it under pressure over and over, and the internal structure changes, gets denser. Not because the pressure was good for it, just because that's what happens when something survives enough pressure." I thought about the evolutionary record I had just read, about the feline predators and the pack hunters and the aquatic hunters and the small species in the middle of all of it, carrying its experience like a weight for 10,000 generations until the weight had changed the shape of the thing carrying it. "And the fauna," I said, "the apex class. They sense that." He did not answer immediately. He looked out at the dark. "They read something," he said. "I don't fully understand what. But their pattern recognition systems are base level. Same as anything. They have categories. Safe to approach, not safe to approach. And something about us puts us in the second category." "Not your physical capability," I said, because it was not. His physical capability was objectively insufficient to threaten an apex-class wildlands predator, and I was not going to pretend otherwise. "No," he agreed easily. He was not offended. "Then what?" He looked at me directly for the first time in this conversation. Full attention, the kind that had weight. "What are you," he said, "when you are not afraid of something that should scare you, when you have been scared by it long enough that the fear just became part of how you move?" I did not have an answer for that. He turned back to the tree line. "Whatever that is," he said, "that's what they read." I stood there for a while, long enough to be certain that the thing in the forest had not moved closer, long enough for the night to settle into its deeper quiet. "I have been watching you for 4 days," I said finally. "I have not once seen your hands shake." He looked down at his hands, gloved, steady, then back at me. "I'm scared most of the time," he said. "I just got good at standing in it." That statement sat between us for a moment. "How long?" I asked. "How long what?" "How long have you been doing this work?" 12 years in the Accord. Before that, he stopped. The classified sections of his file were there in the pause. "Long enough to know what I'm looking at." "And what are you looking at here?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he might not answer. "Something old," he said finally. "Something that's been here long enough to have its own rules. We're walking through their territory, and they're deciding about us. Every encounter, every time they could close the distance and don't. They're gathering data. On us. On what we are. What category we fit in. And if they decide we fit in the wrong category, he looked at me with something that might have been respect. Then we won't make it to the extraction point, he said. But I don't think that's going to happen. Why not? Because they've had 4 days to make that decision, and they keep choosing not to. I thought about the Veth stalkers that had tracked us and turned away. The creature in the western corridor that had paralleled us and then departed. The Vethkai that had stood at 65 meters with every physical advantage and then simply left. They're not choosing not to attack, I said slowly. They're choosing to accept our presence. Yeah, that should not be possible. We are intruders in their territory. The documented response is elimination of the threat. The documented response is based on teams that moved like intruders, that behaved like prey, trying to hide. He looked at the dark forest. We're not hiding. We are walking through their territory as if we have a right to be here. Yeah, that is arrogance. No, he said, it's not arrogance if you've earned it, and my species earned it the hard way. I looked at him in the dim light from the camp behind us. This human who carried himself like a man who had spent a long time learning that survival was not about being stronger. It was about being the thing that refuses to stop. The comms check is tomorrow morning, I said. We are scheduled to reach the backup relay point in 3 days. I know. If the fauna behavior changes, it won't. You cannot know that. No, he agreed, but I've been doing this long enough to read the pattern. They've made their assessment. Now they're just confirming it. And if you are wrong, he looked at me with those steady eyes that had seen things his file would not let him tell me about. Then you activate the emergency extraction and you get your team out. And you write in your report that the human specialist made a tactical error. I would not. You would, because that's the right call. Your team, your responsibility, your decision. He turned back to the forest. I'm just here to make sure you have options when you make it. I stood there beside him in the dark and felt something shift in my understanding. Not of him, of what he represented. He was not here to protect me from the wildlands. He was here to teach the wildlands what it meant to face something that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning how to survive things that should have killed it. And somewhere in the deep forest, old things with old instincts were reading that lesson and making their decisions accordingly. Get some rest, princess, he said. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. I went back to my tent. I wrote in my log, the Vethkai held its distance for 47 seconds and then withdrew. Kurith's position outside the barrier was the decisive variable. I am not yet able to articulate the precise mechanism by which this functioned. I'm beginning to think the mechanism is not technically articulable. I added, he told me his species was prey. He told me they learned to carry fear differently. The fauna here read that difference and categorized accordingly. I do not know if I believe this. I do know that the evidence supports it, and my disbelief is becoming less relevant than the data. I paused. Then I wrote, tomorrow we reach the halfway point of the survey. If the pattern holds, we will complete the mission without casualty. If the pattern breaks, I will need to make decisions I am not yet certain I know how to make. I closed the log. Outside, the forest was quiet, not empty, settled, held by whatever things lived in it that had looked at us and made their calculations and decided we were something new, something that did not fit their categories, something they would let pass. The 5th day brought silence of a different kind. We found the second kill site just after dawn, larger than the first. The tracks were deeper. Whatever had made them had been moving fast, pursuing something. The blood trail led north into terrain too broken for our equipment to follow. Davin Korith crouched beside the largest impression and placed his hand in it the same way he had done before. This time I understood what he was doing. He was memorizing the weight, the gait, the spacing. He was building a picture of the thing that had made these marks so that when he saw it again, and we both knew he would see it again, he would recognize it not as a category, but as an individual. He stood, looked north, said nothing. We moved on. By midday, we had covered 8 kilometers. The forest had changed, not obviously. The same species of trees, the same canopy density, but the birds had changed, not fewer birds, no birds. And the sounds of the smaller fauna, the background noise that had been present every hour of the previous 4 days dropped to nothing, not quiet, silenced. There is a difference between those two things, and I had not had a word for it until that moment. Quiet is the absence of sound. This was sound that had learned to leave. We are being tracked, Dr. Kale said quietly. He was watching his sensor array with the expression of a man who did not trust what it was telling him. Confirmed, Tech Joran said. Thermal signature? Northern ridge, 800 meters. Large, moving parallel to our position. I checked my display. The signature was there. Consistent, patient, not closing, not retreating, just there, matching our pace with the precision of something that had done this before. Veth Marath, Dr. Sarah said. Her voice was steady, but I heard what was underneath it. We all did. The database entry for Veth Marath was short and clear. Largest confirmed land predator in the Veth wildlands. 2 documented individuals in this region. No safe approach distance established. Last recorded encounter, 3 Sarinthi casualties. Mission status, total loss. Davenkorth looked at the ridge. His expression had not changed. It was the same expression he had worn when the Vethkai appeared. The same expression he wore when he stood at the perimeter each night. Calm, present, carrying something. It is not attacking, I said. No. Why not? Still deciding. How long will it decide? He looked at me, full attention, the kind with weight, as long as it needs to. The comms array went down on the morning of the 6th day. Not completely. The suit-to-suit local channel stayed functional. But the uplink to the station relay, the emergency beacon connection, the extraction request line, all of it dropped to static at the same moment. TechJorn spent 90 minutes running diagnostics. Dr. Kyle and Dr. Sarah documented fauna while he worked. Davenkorth checked the physical array unit, inspected every connection, climbed to the top of the portable relay tower and checked the atmospheric sensors at its apex. He came down and stood beside me. Magnetic interference, he said. Deep ore deposit about 40 kilometers north. The survey grid put us closer to it than the pre-mission calculations predicted. It is going to stay down until we get clear of the interference radius. How long? I said. At least until we reach the backup relay point. I pulled up the terrain map. The backup relay point was 22 kilometers northeast. Between us, and it was territory marked in red on my display. Veth Marath range. I want to explain what that meant in practical terms. Our water supply was calculated for 4 more days. Extraction without comms meant the station would send a search team on standard missing contact protocol. That protocol activated after 72 hours of no signal. 72 hours was 3 days. 3 days on 4 days of water was acceptable in theory. In a non-functional comm situation in the Veth wildlands, in the territory of 2 Veth Marath, it was not acceptable in practice. I looked at my team. Dr. Kyle had stopped working. He was looking at the map on his own display with the expression of a man running calculations he did not want to finish. Dr. Sarah was already checking her equipment. TechJorn started breaking down the relay tower. We go through, I said. Dr. Kyle looked at me. Station protocol for Veth Marath territory is... Station protocol for Veth Marath territory was written for circumstances where waiting was viable. I said, it is not viable. We go through. There was a moment of silence, the kind that sits heavy. Then Dr. KL started packing. I looked at Davenkorth. He was studying the terrain map. His expression was the same expression he always had when he was looking at something he was already processing in a way I could not observe. You have crossed territory like this before, I said. On this species, he said, something with a similar profile, another posting. What was the outcome? He looked up from the map. I'm still here, he said. The silence between us carried more weight than I had intended to put in it. That is not a statistical assurance, I said. No, he said, but it's the honest one. We entered Veth Marath territory at midday on the 7th day. The forest changed the moment we crossed the boundary. Not in obvious ways. The same trees, the same density, but you felt it the way you feel a room get cold. The boundary was not marked. There were no territorial markers, no physical indication, but every member of my team felt it at the same time. We had entered a space that was held. The silence was total. Not the silence of the previous day when the smaller fauna had gone quiet. This was deeper. This was the silence of a place where everything alive had learned that sound was permission to be found. I ran constant sensor sweeps, nothing above mid-class registering within detection range. Either we were alone in this section of territory, or whatever was here was not registering on my sensors the way the Vethkai had not registered until it was at 65 meters. I knew which one it was. Davenkorth moved differently again. Not like in the outer territory where his footfalls were simply quiet. Here he had changed something more fundamental. His breathing, which I had always been able to faintly detect on my atmospheric sensors, dropped out of my sensor range entirely. Not because he stopped breathing, because he had modulated it to a level below what my sensors were calibrated to pick up. I did not know when that becomes an instinct rather than a technique. I watched it happen and I recorded it, and I had no category for it. 2 hours in, he stopped. Not a sudden stop, not an alarm response. He simply stopped walking with the same lack of drama that he did everything, and he stood completely still and looked at the vegetation to our northeast. The rest of us stopped. My sensors picked up the displacement pattern in the upper canopy, 200 meters out, moving in a slow, deliberate arc. Not fleeing, not approaching, circling. I could not see it. The canopy was too dense, and the movement was too controlled for visual confirmation. But the thermal trace was there, and the size estimate from the displacement geometry was significant enough that I ran the calculation twice and then stopped calculating and just accepted the number. Barrier up, I said. The team activated their units. The interlocking field spread to its full coverage diameter and went solid. Davin Korath did not activate his barrier. He stepped forward. Korath, he stopped. Looked back at me. You need a barrier. The barrier tells it that what is inside is separated, he said. It can read the separation. It knows there is a distinction between what we are and what we think we can face. Dr. Sarah spoke quietly from behind me. You are saying the barrier marks us as prey. Davin looked at her. I am saying the barrier marks what we think we are. He turned back to the northeast. The canopy displacement had stopped. Something out there was watching us with more patience than I had experienced from any fauna in my career. And I had documented 312 species across 4 survey assignments. Davin Korath stood at the barrier edge for a long time, 14 minutes, 11 seconds. I ran calculations. I ran threat assessments. I ran extraction vector analyses. I ran every tactical evaluation I had been trained to run, and every one of them came back with the same terminal variable. If the Veth Marath closed the distance, there was no viable response option available to us. No viable response option. I had been in situations with limited options. I had never been in a situation where the taxonomy stopped at none. The canopy displacement shifted away. It did not leave with urgency. It moved with the same deliberate, unhurried motion it had used to circle us. It took its time about going, as if it wanted to be understood that it was leaving because it had decided to leave and not for any other reason. The forest stayed silent for a long time after the displacement signature faded. Then slowly the birds came back. Not all at once, one first, then a small group. Then the background noise of the forest reassembled itself from the perimeter inward, like a room filling from the walls toward the center. We keep moving, Davin said. We kept moving. I walked beside him for the first time in the entire transit. I had kept formation position before, which put me at point assessment and him at the rear. I fell out of formation position and walked beside him without planning to. How do you know it will not come back? I said. It could come back, he said, but it made a decision. It will stay with it for a while. What decision? He thought about it, that we do not fit the category it was expecting. We covered the remaining 9 kilometers in 4 hours. The backup relay station was where the map said it would be. Tech Joran had the uplink active within 20 minutes. Station connection reestablished. Extraction shuttle available in 41 hours. We made camp at the relay station. That night, I sat outside and looked at the forest for a long time, thinking about categories, about the things that get put in them and the things that do not fit, and what happens to a category when reality keeps refusing to match the shape you made for it. I went inside and I wrote in my log. I wrote, the first Veth Marath held its distance for 14 minutes and 11 seconds and then withdrew. Korath's position outside the barrier was the decisive variable. I am not yet able to articulate the precise mechanism by which this functioned. I am beginning to think the mechanism is not technically articulable. I added, some things resist the shape you try to put them in. That is not an error in the thing. I closed the file. The forest was quiet in that occupied way. It had been quiet every night since the first one, held by whatever things in it had decided over 7 days and through whatever communication fauna used that we do not have instruments precise enough to fully measure that this section of the wildlands was different now, that the category of what moved through here had changed. I woke at first light change on the 8th day with a certain knowledge that something was different. Not an alarm, not a sensor alert, just a quality to the silence outside the relay station that had a shape I recognized. A silence that was not empty, but occupied, held by something. I checked my sensors. Thermal signature, 800 meters northwest. Moving in a slow, patient arc around the relay station perimeter. Too large for anything in the mid-class range. The size estimate came back and I read it twice, and then I accessed the Wildlands database and cross-referenced the territorial map. There were two confirmed Veth Marath in this region. The one we had encountered the previous day was the smaller of the two. It had a documented territory in the central zone. The northern territory belonged to the second individual, the one that had not been documented in a successful close encounter in 11 cycles. The one whose database entry included a note that the incident count from its territory was significant enough to have triggered an accord review of survey protocols. This was not yesterday's creature. This was the other one. I sat with that information for a moment. Then I got up and went outside. Davin Korath was already at the perimeter. He was always at the perimeter before I found him there, and I had stopped being surprised by it. He was facing northwest. "You know it is there," I said. "Been tracking us since before dawn," he said. "Probably picked up our trail when we entered the territory yesterday." "The second one." "Yeah." I stood beside him. The sensor on my forearm was tracking the thermal signature. Slow and patient. 800 meters and closing in increments so small, they were almost not movement at all. "The extraction shuttle is 40 hours out," I said. 39, he said. I checked. "We cannot stay in this relay station for 39 hours with a Veth Marath of this classification circling the perimeter." "No," he agreed, "and we cannot move through territory it is already tracking us in." Not easily. I watched the thermal signature complete another arc. 800 meters. Consistent. Patient in the way that only things with very long hunting histories are patient. Not hungry patient. Assessing patient. Working through something methodically. "It has been watching you specifically," I said. "Since yesterday, not the team. You." He did not look surprised. "Yeah." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yesterday's encounter," he said. "The one that held back. It would have moved through this territory after we did. They communicate through marking, through trail signs. The second one read what the first one decided about us. And it wants to verify the decision," I said. "Wants to make its own." I thought about that. About a creature with the kind of intelligence that reads the decision history of its competitors and then goes to confirm it with its own direct assessment. That was not instinct-level fauna behavior. That was something considerably more complex. The others were awake now. I could hear movement inside the relay station. Dr. Kael was going to come outside in approximately 3 minutes based on his established routine, and he was going to see the sensor reading, and he was going to have a reaction that was going to be honest and reasonable and completely unhelpful to the situation. I made a decision. "When extraction arrives," I said to Davin, "we need to be in the clearing 3 kilometers southeast, open ground. The shuttle needs at least 200 meters of flat space." "I know." "The thermal signature is between us and that clearing." "I know." "We are going to have to move through it." He turned and looked at me, full attention, the kind with weight. "You do not have to be outside the barrier for this," he said. "I know," I said. We looked at each other. "You have been reading the database," he said, "extensively." I thought about how to say it. I had been thinking about how to say it for 2 days and I still did not have clean phrasing for it. "Your species was shaped by pressure over a very long time," I said. "The pressure changed the shape. The fauna here read the shape, not the capability, the shape." "Yeah," he said. "I am wondering," I said carefully, "if the shape is readable only in your species, or if the process of being reshaped by pressure is the thing that gets read." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Honest answer, I do not know. I have never seen another species try it." I looked at the thermal signature on my sensor. 780 meters. Still circling, still assessing. "I suppose," I said, "that today is going to produce data either way." He almost smiled. I had cataloged the specific expression he made when something approached, but did not reach a smile. I had been cataloging it for 7 days. "Today is going to produce data," he agreed. We moved at first full light. The forest was wrong again from the first step. Not Veth Marath territory wrong with its heavy silence quality. This was different, more present. The air felt like it was being read, like every sound we made was going somewhere, and something at the other end of it was listening. My sensor tracked the thermal signature at 650 meters when we started. By the first kilometer, it was 500. It was closing, not rushing, not charging, closing the way you close when you are deciding. when you are gathering the information you need to reach a conclusion. I kept moving. I kept my breathing steady. I thought about everything I had read in the evolutionary database, about the species in the middle of a competitive biosphere that had been hunted for long enough to be reshaped by it, about what persistence looked like from the inside when it was not a strategy, but a structure. At kilometer 1.5, Davin moved up beside me. He had been at the rear. I did not need to ask why he had moved forward. The thermal signature was at 420 meters. "It is going to make contact before the clearing," he said quietly. "I know." "When it does." "I know," I said. He looked at me. "I have been in this forest for 7 days," I said. "I have been watching what happens when you face it instead of containing it. I have been reading the evolutionary record of your species for 2 nights. I am not going into this without understanding what I am doing. It is different when it is actually there. Most things are." He nodded. That specific nod, the one from the briefing room on the first day, the one that had bothered me because it contained nothing it should have contained. No nerves, no performance. I understood it better now. 300 meters. The forest was completely silent. Dr. Ko had activated his barrier. I heard the hum of it behind me. I heard Dr. Sarah's array running, documenting, because she would document this if it was the last thing she ever documented. 250 meters. I saw it, not fully. A shape in the heavy vegetation at the forest edge where the canopy thinned toward the clearing ahead. A mass of dark presence that was larger than the trees around it managed to suggest and somehow still moving between them with absolute precision. 7 limbs that I could count. The 7th a muscular structure that functioned as a stabilizer. Eyes that caught the early light and held it longer than eyes should. Old eyes. I had read the database entry on this individual. Estimated age significant. The database used the word significant when the calculation was an estimate based on territory size and behavior history, and they did not want to commit to a number. Those eyes had seen a great many things not survive to reach the clearing. Davin stopped. I stopped beside him. 200 meters. It stopped moving. The elder Vethmarath and the human specialist and the Sarenthi princess stood in the last thin edge of forest before the extraction clearing. And for a moment that lasted considerably longer than its actual duration, nothing happened. My barrier was deactivated. I had deactivated it 40 meters back without telling Davin. He had not asked about it. Maybe he had noticed. Maybe he had decided not to mention it. I found I did not need to know which. The elder Vethmarath looked at Davin for a very long time. Then it looked at me. I had not been looked at by anything like this before. Not looked at in the sense of observed. Looked at in the sense of assessed, categorized, placed into whatever taxonomy this creature carried in its very old, very patient mind. I held its gaze. I thought I am 300 cycles old. I have been trained since I could walk in the mechanics of command and diplomacy and assessment. I have been wrong about more things in the last 7 days than I have been wrong about in the previous 300 cycles combined. I do not know what I am in the taxonomy of this creature's experience. I know what I am not. I am not prey that is afraid of being seen. The elder Vethmarath held the assessment for what my internal time sense recorded as 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Then it turned, not backing away, not fleeing, nothing in its movement suggested urgency. It turned the way a very certain thing turns when it has reached a conclusion and no longer needs the subject of its analysis. It walked northwest, back into the deep territory, each step deliberate, each step the step of something that had decided. The clearing was 40 meters ahead. I walked into it. The sunlight was different in the open space after so long under the canopy. It came from all angles instead of filtering down from above, and it was warmer than the forest air, and I stood in it for a moment and let my sensors recalibrate to the open environment readings. Davin stood beside me. We did not say anything for a while. The others came out of the tree line behind us. Dr. Keshel had the look of a man who had resolved somewhere in the last 20 minutes to update his understanding of certain fundamental assumptions. Dr. Sarah was reviewing her documentation with the focused attention of someone who could not fully believe the quality of the data she had just collected. Tech Joran stood quietly in the light. 37 hours, Davin said. For the shuttle. Yeah. Then we wait, I said. The extraction shuttle arrived 36 hours later. I was the last one on board. I stood in the clearing for a moment before I walked up the ramp. I looked at the tree line. Somewhere in those trees, 2 Vethmarath had made decisions about us. Somewhere in the deep territory, impressions in the soil still held the shape of Davin's hand in ancient apex tracks. The forest was quiet, not empty, not silenced, settled. I walked up the ramp. On the transit back to the station, I wrote my final log entry. I wrote the factual summary first. The mission parameters, the data collected, the fauna species documented, the incident reports. I wrote it all correctly with appropriate citation and sensor data attached. Then I opened a separate file, private, not for the council. I wrote, I came to the Veth wildlands with one human, one sidearm, in the complete certainty that I understood what I had been given. I was wrong in every direction that certainty pointed. I wrote, Davin Korath does not have a capability I can list in a standard assessment field. He has a structure, something that was built over a very long time by a process that was not comfortable or controlled or designed. He carries it the way old trees carry the shape of the things that grew around them. You cannot separate it from him. You can only look at it and understand that the shape of him is the record of everything his species survived to become. I wrote, I stepped out of the barrier in the extraction clearing, not because I had become what he is. I stepped out because 7 days in that forest had shown me that the barrier was in part a statement, and the statement I had been making with the barrier deployed said something about what I believed I was, something I was no longer certain was accurate. I closed the file. The station lights came into sensor range through the shuttle window. Commander Thrace would be at the dock. There would be a debrief. There would be the political machinery of the Accord and my father's council, and the assignment that had been dressed as honor and was about to be dressed as completed service. I looked at Davin Korath. He was sitting across the shuttle cabin, resting the way experienced people rest when they have the opportunity. He glanced over. Your boots are still worn on the left heel, I said. He looked down, back up. That small expression moved across his face, the one that was close to a smile but had decided not to be. Always been that way, he said. What does it indicate? I asked. I have been meaning to ask since the briefing room on the first day. He thought about it with genuine consideration, the way he considered most things. Old injury, he said, compensated for it long enough it became the way I walk. I thought about that, about compensation, about the things a body does when it has been through something, the adjustments it makes that become permanent, the new geometry of a thing that has been reshaped by what it survived. Of course, I said. He looked at me with that quiet, full attention. You figured something out, he said. Several things, I said. I am still filing them. He nodded. I looked out the window at the station growing in the sensor field. The category field in his file was still blank. I had decided to leave it that way. Not because I could not find the words, because the right words did not fit the shape of what I had seen, and forcing them would make the record smaller than the truth. Some things resist filing. That is not an error in the thing. It is a limit in the category. I was beginning to think that knowing the difference between those two things was the most important work a mind could do. The dock lights came on. We landed. 3 days later, I received a message from the Xenobiology Archive. They had cross-referenced my fauna behavioral data with Earth's paleontological record. The correlation was unsettling. Every apex predator that had hunted humans during their evolutionary history was extinct. Not from climate change, not from asteroid impacts, not from habitat loss, from being outlasted. Saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, short-faced bears, terror birds, cave lions, giant hyenas, megalania. Every single species that had preyed on humans for millions of years was gone, and humans were still here. The archivist's note was brief. They didn't become apex by being stronger. They became apex by refusing to die when everything else did. I thought about the elder Veth Marath, about its ancient eyes assessing me in the clearing, about the decision it had made. It had looked at me and seen something that its instincts honed over countless generations told it to leave alone. Not because I was dangerous in the way predators understood danger, but because I carried the shape of something that had survived everything that had tried to end it. I had learned that from Davin Korath, or perhaps I had learned to recognize what had always been there, the structure that forms when pressure is applied long enough, the shape that survival takes when there is no other choice. I opened Davin's personnel file one last time. The category field was still blank. I closed it without adding anything. Some things I had learned resist categorization not because they are poorly understood, but because the categories themselves are insufficient to contain what they are. That was not an error in the thing. It was a recognition that some truths are larger than the systems we build to hold them. I archived the file and began writing my report for the council. I had a great deal to explain, and I suspected they would understand very little of it. But I would try anyway, because that I was beginning to understand was what it meant to carry forward what you had learned in a place where the old rules did not apply. You stood in the new knowledge and you let it reshape you. And then you went back and you showed others what you had become.